Helen worked as a cleaner for a construction company in the city. She was short, full-figured, and always dressed in a pair of knockoff rags. Sometimes, she showed up for work smelling of alcohol, and on those days, she was unable to work properly. Her older daughter, Rosie, a thin and pale schoolgirl, worked alongside her. Rosie was the first, but not the last child in the family. Helen had given birth to many children, but couldn't name the fathers of any of them. Helen spent all her spare time with local vagrants and drunks who often visited her home, regardless of the time of day. They spent hours clanging bottles in the living room and talking loudly. The children were used to the fact that, during these moments, they needed to quickly grab something from the kitchen, at least bread, to avoid going hungry, and then sit quietly in their room while the company had their fun. Helen's children grew up like weeds in a field, almost from birth, accustomed to taking care of each other. Rosie, the eldest daughter, had just turned 18. While still in school, she worked part-time several times a week at a clothing store, sorting and hanging up clothes. The second child was Paul, who had just turned 12. He spent most of his time outside, but never refused to help his older sister at home, knowing that she would always give him something from her meager salary. The youngest, Judy, would turn 7 in a few months. She was a quiet and sickly child who struggled to communicate with her peers. When she went out to the playground, she was like a frightened little animal, always staying away from the noisy courtyard children. Judy envied the neighboring girls who built sand castles or pushed beautiful dolls in bright toy strollers around the yard. But such toys were never in Judy's family. All she had to play with was an old, battered teddy bear with one eye missing and a small plastic bucket with an equally small shovel. Throughout Rosie's years in school, teachers always praised the diligent student and used her as an example for her classmates. Rosie easily understood any subject. It was enough for her to read the material once, and she was ready to answer on the board immediately. All the teachers knew the family the girl was growing up in and felt sorry for her. "She's so smart, almost an excellent student. It's a shame she doesn't have a better future with such a mother," the teachers whispered among themselves. If it weren't for taking care of her younger siblings, she could have easily gone to college. Though, being a cleaner doesn't require that, the vice principal added. She's going to have to substitute for her mother now, otherwise, she'll be fired because Helen's pregnant again. Even though Helen tried to hide her 6-month pregnancy, it was already noticeable. Everyone knew there would soon be another addition to the family, but they didn't even suspect what it would be. At the age of 45, Helen already had 3 children, though it was unclear who the fathers were. Helen was expecting twins. Probably, there wasn't a single person who didn't condemn this negligent mother of many children. Everyone who knew her thought she only needed children for social benefits. It was difficult to support 3 children on a cleaning lady's salary, but Helen still managed to host wild drinking parties with her friends. Fortunately, sympathetic neighbors occasionally brought bags of clothes to her door, which the entire family wore. Children in the neighborhood would shout after Helen, "Hey, rag woman, bring my socks. Maybe you're bringing my underwear." Rosie and Judy tried to walk away quickly, but Helen hadn't paid attention to such treatment for a long time. In the last months of her pregnancy, Helen found it increasingly difficult to work. Rosie had to replace her every time Helen felt unwell. Her boss, who had little regard for Helen, simply wanted the floors cleaned, and he was pleased to have Rosie, who did the job much better than her mother. Rosie, feeling sorry for her mother and fearing she might get fired, rushed to the office to clean right after school and then studied until midnight. This was heartbreaking for Rosie because it was not the future she had dreamed of. All she thought about was seeing herself in a beautiful uniform with a neat hairstyle. When she was 10 years old, she found a magazine featuring such beauties standing by the gangway of a huge liner. Since then, this picture has hung over her bed and symbolized an unattainable goal. Teachers at school knew about her dream and tried to support her, urging her not to give up and to pursue it. Rosie was very attractive, quite unlike her mother, with delicate facial features. If Helen hadn't pregnant again, Rosie might have tried to enroll in stewardess school. However, she understood that as soon as her mother gave birth, She would have to become the family's breadwinner, leaving no time for further education. Nevertheless, the hope of realizing her dream still burned in her soul, and she even started setting aside a penny for future education. She was happy that she could safely leave her younger siblings at home. Paul and Judy felt sorry for their older sister and tried to help with everything around the house while she was at work. The local hooligans, who knew Paul, would never have believed that he could cook, feed his younger sister, read to her, and put her to bed at night when Rosie was working. Only his sisters knew that Paul was a kind, intelligent, and responsible boy. Life had made him embittered toward people because his classmates laughed at and mocked him, calling him a beggar. Teenagers, spoiled by parental love and care, often taunted him, saying things like, "Mom is going to throw out my old stuff today. Maybe I should carry it for you." Those standing nearby would support the joker, and everyone would laugh together. In those moments, Paul would rush at the bullies with his fists, only to find himself inevitably in the principal's office, listening to another lecture. Helen rarely went to school to address these issues. Instead, everything fell to Rosie. The principal would lecture for hours, saying, "Well, Rosie, influence your brother. Look at you. What a smart girl you are, but your brother is just a little bandit." With such behavior, he could end up in jail, the principal would say. Every time, Rosie promised to talk to her brother. She would return home from school and tearfully beg Paul, "I'm begging you. Don't get into fights anymore. They won't even let you into school later." Meanwhile, the time before the birth was growing shorter, and Rosie was becoming increasingly worried. Her mother had not struggled so much during the previous pregnancies as she did with the twins. It seemed that the years were taking their toll. One day, Rosie rushed to the office where her mother, Helen, worked. Upon opening the door, she saw her mother writhing in pain on a visitor's chair in the reception hall. The director, as white as a ghost, was muttering anxiously, "Where are the doctors?" "Helen, hold on. I beg you." He turned to Rosie, "Sit with your mother now. The ambulance is on its way. I've called them." The paramedics arrived a few minutes later and took Helen to the hospital. The next morning, when Rosie rushed to the maternity hospital, she was informed that her mother had died from a heart attack. However, thanks to a cesarean section, 2 beautiful boys had been born and saved. This news was like a sharp knife to Rosie's heart. She didn't faint only because the doctor managed to quickly catch her by the arm and sit her down on the couch next to him. He continued talking about the baby's weight and height and when she could pick them up and bury Helen. But Rosie heard it all as if from a distance. She silently stood up and left. Rosie sat on a bench in the park in front of the maternity hospital, covering her face with her hands and crying bitterly. She didn't know how to go on living, how to cope with all this grief. Rosie lost track of time, not remembering the following days clearly. Taking care of her brother and sister, organizing the funeral, everything felt like a terrible dream. The neighbors helped a lot, feeling sorry for the poor girl, and her mother's boss brought her some money. There were only 10 people at the funeral, 3 of whom were Rosie, Paul, and Judy, who didn't stop crying. When it was all over, Rosie begged the director to take the place of her mother since she was now the only breadwinner in the family. The girl worked around the clock, mopping floors for 12 hours a day, then washing and cooking for the younger ones until midnight. Luckily, the school was behind her. One evening, returning home, she found the apartment empty. None of the children were at home. Rosie's heart pounded with a terrible premonition. She rushed out onto the street, hoping they were nearby, though she knew they would never leave the house at this time without her permission. Exhausted, Rosie found a bench by the entrance, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was about to go to the police when her neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Harriman, sat down next to her. Mrs. Harriman had been Rosie's first teacher and often greeted her with pastries when the kids were home alone. "Rosie, the children were taken away by child welfare authorities," Mrs. Harriman said gently. "The neighbors complained that the mother died and you're not home all day. The representative said the children were left to themselves. You're already an adult, and they'll all be sent to an orphanage." Rosie's heart sank. I'll still take them all back, she insisted, but Mrs. Harriman calmly advised her, "My dear, you should go study now. They won't give them back to you at this moment, but if you study hard and get a good job, then you can take them back." Rosie spent several hours at her neighbor's place, crying and calming down. When she returned home, she didn't sleep all night, thinking about Mrs. Harriman's words. By morning, she had made up her mind to pursue her dream of becoming a stewardess. She packed her modest belongings and went to say goodbye to her kind neighbor. "Thank you, Mrs. Harriman, for supporting me and advising me on what to do," Rosie said, hugging her. "I've decided to fulfill my dream and become a stewardess because then I can take my kids back." Mrs. Harriman asked her to wait and went to the kitchen. When she returned a few minutes later, she handed Rosie a package and a note. "Here, I baked some pies that'll be helpful for you on the road," she said with a smile. "And there's also a phone number and address of my good old classmate. She lives in the city where you'll be studying. For the first few days, you can stay with her. I'll call her today and let her know about you. She lives alone in a spacious apartment. Her husband died many years ago. I think she'll be happy to take in such a smart girl." They hugged each other goodbye, and Rosie set out to start her new, independent life. Of course, it was scary for her to be alone in a big, unfamiliar city, but the dream of becoming a stewardess gave her strength. Rosie went to the address given by Mrs. Harriman and was greeted at the door by a small, thin old lady. "Good afternoon," Rosie began timidly. "Mrs. Harriman gave me your address." The hostess smiled kindly, opening the door wider and inviting her in. "Yes, my old friend called me yesterday and sent me a modest and beautiful girl. I see she didn't disappoint. Come in, don't be shy. Otherwise, I'll go crazy here alone. Let me show you your room right away." Upon entering the apartment, Rosie tried to explain, "I'm only here for a day. Then I'll go to the dormitory or rent an apartment." The woman looked at her, surprised. "Are you crazy? A hostel or a rented apartment? If Mrs. Harriman asked me for someone, it meant that person was worth it. I live alone, and my only son lives very far away, so I'm pleased that Mrs. Harriman sent me such a good neighbor." Rosie reached into her small, worn-out vintage shoulder bag and pulled out neatly folded bills from its depths. She handed them to the elderly woman, saying timidly, "Here, this is all I have. Let me just rent a room at your place. It's not much, but I'll compensate once I start earning." Despite being a tiny elderly woman in her 70s, Mrs. Gibson had a mischievous spirit at heart. She took the bills, squinted as if examining the denominations, then returned them to Rosie's bag, placing it back on her shoulder. She looked at the bewildered Rosie and said playfully, "This money will come in handy for you in the city for a couple of days. Let's make a deal. You won't pay me anything for the first 3 or 4 months. Once you start working, you can pay me then." Mrs. Gibson showed Rosie to a small but cozy room, which was her son's. It was adorned with sports medals, certificates, and trophies. Seeing Rosie's confusion, Mrs. Gibson said with a hint of sadness, "My son rarely visits me, but I want his room to feel lived in. I've made the bed, and there's plenty of space in the closet. You can stay here as long as you need to. If his awards are in the way, I can move them to my room." He was into swimming and always came back with awards. That evening, they sat in the kitchen for over 2 hours. "You're smart. You'll learn everything and then get your brothers and sisters back. But for now, focus on your studies," Mrs. Gibson advised. The next day, Rosie went straight to the airport because she didn't know where to study to become a flight attendant. To her surprise, there was an announcement for flight attendant recruitment at the entrance. After carefully studying all the requirements listed in the announcement, she was almost certain that she would make it. She did. Rosie passed all the necessary tests, checks, and medical examinations with ease. She flew back to Mrs. Gibson on wings. "I've enrolled. I'm going to be a flight attendant," Rosie shouted, kicking off her shoes and walking with a graceful stride, leaning over imaginary passengers and speaking to them with a captivating smile. Mrs. Gibson, who had come out of the kitchen at Rosie's call, put her hands on her chest and laughed happily, watching this improvised scene. When Rosie reached the end of the hallway, she happily plopped onto a chair. Mrs. Gibson said, "Good for you. I never doubted it. You're a natural-born flight attendant. Everything will be wonderful for you. I'm sure of it. I knew you'd come with good news, so I baked your favorite cheesecake," Mrs. Gibson said with a smile. "I can't forget the story about the piece of cake that Mrs. Harriman brought to you, and you only managed to have a teaspoon. Now you have every right to eat it all yourself." Rosie had indeed tasted that seemingly airy and incredibly delicious dessert only once. Mrs. Harriman had treated her to a piece of cheesecake for her birthday, but at home, she had seen how much her younger brother and sister enjoyed the treat. Rosie had allowed herself only a couple of small bites, no bigger than a walnut. Several years had passed, but the taste remained unforgettable for her. Now she could eat an entire cake standing on the table, but instead of joy, tears filled her eyes. Mrs. Gibson immediately understood what Rosie was thinking. She took Rosie's hand and said softly, "Don't worry, dear. You will get your siblings back once you stand on your own 2 feet. And I'll bake a big cheesecake for each of you. For now, you're with me, and you're an incredibly intelligent person who has achieved her goal. You can indulge in the treat." That evening, they once again stayed up late in the kitchen. Rosie excitedly recounted how her testing had gone and how everything had been explained to her about her future, long-awaited profession. She was the happiest person on earth. For the first time in years, she had beautiful, vivid dreams at night. In them, she was on board a huge liner, looking out the windows at the lights of a big city. She wore the same outfit as the girls in the picture. Every morning for several months, Rosie woke up a couple of hours earlier than usual and quickly got ready for her walk to school. She loved these morning walks, which gave her a great mood and a boost of energy for the whole day. To be honest, Rosie tried to save her already meager savings and avoided using public transport. Studying at the courses was enjoyable for her. The group consisted of only 15 people, and all the teachers immediately noticed the smart, open, and charming girl. They were amazed at how easily a single, poorly dressed student from the countryside could grasp everything on the fly. After completing the courses, Rosie was immediately hired by the airline as the best graduate. Soon, her heart pounded with excitement as she climbed up the steps of the plane for the first time. The flight was not very long, only an hour one way, but for someone who had dreamed of seeing clouds from the other side all her life, it passed in a moment. She didn't even realize how quickly she was already back in her city. At home, Rosie enthusiastically told Mrs. Gibson about her impressions. "You can't imagine how beautiful everything looks from out there. It's just a pity that I couldn't press my face against the window and enjoy it all. And the passengers are all so serious. The crew is just wonderful. They're all a bit older, but that's probably a good thing. They take care of me so much." As if waking up from my happiness, Rosie became sad and added, "Now the main thing is to earn money faster to rent an apartment and take my brothers and sister with me." Mrs. Gibson sighed and replied, "Everything will work out for you. See how well it's already going. For now, enough talking, you must be hungry." "I boiled potatoes and fried cutlets," Mrs. Gibson said. "Go take off your uniform and let it wait for the next flight. Let's have dinner." Rosie looked at her uniform as if it were a favorite toy she didn't want to part with. Mrs. Gibson laughed and jokingly scolded her, "Are you going to sleep in this beautiful uniform? Go and take it off. No one will steal it." As much as Rosie wanted to stay beautiful for as long as possible, she had to put on her simple old dress again. She carefully hung her uniform in the closet, with a wild desire to put it back on again soon. For the first few months, Rosie flew on short flights. But once her internship was over, she began to be sent to distant cities. On one of these distant flights, a young, handsome man called out to her. She had seen him before. He often flew on this route. The passenger was probably a businessman, looking about 35 years old, always in a suit, clean-shaven, with a light, very becoming tan. Rosie didn't know much about brand-name items, but the watch and briefcase the stranger carried were similar to those she had seen in expensive magazines left by passengers on the plane. She remembered the man because he had flown with her for several flights in a row. Throughout the entire journey, he tried to catch her eye. When he succeeded, he smiled so radiantly that Rosie felt embarrassed and immediately looked away. Her colleague, the cheerful and carefree Miranda, who witnessed one of these moments, whispered, "Oh, he's flying again and looking at you as if he's going to take you straight from the plane to the wedding. I think he only flies this route for you. I accidentally saw him staring at you at the airport. I wish my handsome man would look at me like that." Rosie approached the man who had called her over. "Excuse me?" "For God's sake," he began quietly. "Do you have any medication for heart pain?" Rosie was momentarily thrown off. The man didn't look sick. On the contrary, his short-sleeved shirt revealed well-defined muscles, and his face had a healthy color. But the girl was scared. Anything could happen. "Just a moment, please," she said. "I'll bring the first aid kit and let me help you recline a bit." She reached for the backrest, but her wrist was easily grabbed by a strong male hand. "I don't think you have the right medicine in your first aid kit," the stranger whispered. "Is it possible to cure the heart of unrequited love?" Rosie was taken aback, her heart racing. She blushed but didn't pull away. Sensing her agitation, the passenger continued, "But there is one way to save me from imminent death. Agree to go out with me." "Today I promise to behave very humbly," Damon said with a playful grin. Rosie looked at him and realized she wanted to go on this date. She found him attractive. Gathering her courage, she gently freed her wrist and, smiling quietly, said, "I'll think about it." The man's face lit up. "My name is Damon, and I'll wait for you as long as it takes. Starting right now, I'll wait after the flight because if a woman says she'll think about it, it means she hasn't said no." For the rest of the journey, Damon never took his eyes off Rosie, which made her very uncomfortable. Rosie wanted to go on this date, but she was also afraid. She had no idea how to behave with a man alone. Everything she knew about relationships came from romantic books borrowed from the library and sentimental TV shows she occasionally watched. After the flight, Rosie and the crew went to the airport building to fill out all the necessary post-flight documents and head home. Miranda was the first to spot Damon. She touched Rosie's elbow and nodded enthusiastically toward him, whispering, "Look, Rosie, you seem to have won a millionaire. That must cost a fortune." In the center of the hall, right in their path, stood Damon with a huge bouquet of beautiful velvet roses. It was hard to count the number of flowers, but it was clear there were no fewer than 100. The man approached Rosie and, as always, with a charming smile, said, "I am pleased to see you again. Of course, this bouquet can't compare to your beauty, but I promise to find and give you a diamond worthy of such beauty soon." Miranda stood with her mouth open as if all this were meant for her. Rosie, on the other hand, took the flowers and said barely audibly, "Thank you very much. They're stunning." The crew commander, the oldest in the team, approached Miranda and, taking her by the arm, said, "Are you heading to the exit? Go with us. We'll see you off. Rosie will figure it out on her own." The colleagues waved goodbye to Rosie and headed toward the exit. Damon, noticing Rosie's flustered state, suggested, "Let me drive you home first. You must be tired. But in the evening, you'll promise me a date. We'll go to a beautiful little restaurant." Damon had a car in the airport parking lot. Rosie didn't know much about car brands, but it was an expensive one. In the sunlight, the Black Beauty sparkled as if it had just come out of the showroom. On the way, Damon told her that he had been briefly married once, but the marriage fell apart allegedly because of his wife's infidelity. He owned a furniture manufacturing company in the city, inherited from his parents, which had been thriving for many years. It was the business trips that took Damon to other cities, where he concluded new contracts. After dropping Rosie off at home, they agreed he would wait for her at the entrance at 6 in the evening. Rosie felt a flutter of excitement and couldn't wait for the evening to come, even though it was only 10 in the morning. When she opened the door to her apartment, Mrs. Gibson was already waiting in the hallway. "Welcome back, Rosie," the old woman said kindly, smiling. "I see your gentleman brought you home, and what flowers. Did he rob a store?" Rosie struggled to bring the bouquet into the room and placed it on the table. "Oh, Mrs. Gibson, I've never had anything like this happen to me before. This is a passenger who often flies with me. He's been looking at me for a long time, and then he spoke up. He's so handsome that it takes my breath away. Mrs. Gibson observed the flowers and said, "Oh, my dear, you've fallen in love. Be careful, these handsome men promise a lot and then break your heart." Rosie immediately flared up in defense of Damon. "Why do you say that?" she said, almost in tears. "You don't know him, and neither do I yet, but I feel that he's not like that." "Well, all right," Mrs. Gibson said, softening. "As they say, we'll see. You rest now, you're probably tired, and I'll go for a walk to my neighbor's." With difficulty waiting for the evening, Rosie put on the only dress she had bought with her first paycheck. It fit perfectly on her slender figure. She ran, like a schoolgirl on her first date, and listened with a pounding heart as Damon joked and told funny stories all the way. It was incredibly pleasant to be with him, and she laughed heartily at every joke he made. Rosie felt as though she had known him forever, and with each passing minute, he felt closer and closer. Damon brought Rosie to a small but very cozy restaurant. At the entrance, they were greeted by Damon's friend, the owner of the place. "Hello, dear guests," the man said, first kissing Rosie's hand. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Henry, a devoted friend of this gentleman." Damon whispered in my ear about the goddess he had met flying at bird height, "But I couldn't even imagine you'd be so beautiful." "I'm happily married, so I can only admire your beauty from a distance." Rosie blushed, feeling embarrassed. "No one has ever complimented me so much." "Thank you very much." Henry led them into the restaurant, where a beautiful melody played in a private room with a table set for two in the center. "Why just one table and no other visitors?" Rosie asked in surprise. "This evening, the music and this room are just for you." "My heart seems to belong to you forever," Damon replied. Rosie was thrilled. Everything felt like a scene from one of the novels she had read. They spent a wonderful evening talking, getting to know each other better, dancing, and enjoying themselves. Rosie's head was spinning, not from champagne but from happiness. Damon escorted her home, and she was pleased he didn't rush things, wanting the unforgettable evening to end just as it was. The next morning, Rosie woke up with a smile, remembering their date. Mrs. Gibson knocked on the door, smiling mysteriously. "While you were sleeping, someone remembered you and sent something nice. Go to the kitchen and take a look. At this rate, we'll need to open a flower shop soon." Rosie leaped out of bed and ran to the kitchen in her nightgown. There, she found a huge basket of flowers and an envelope. She opened it quickly, squealing with delight as she read the contents. She held the postcard close to her chest, humming cheerfully and spinning around the kitchen with closed eyes and a happy smile. Mrs. Gibson's voice brought her back to reality. "Go change your clothes. What if the prince comes?" Rosie went to her room, clutching the postcard to her chest. She was relieved after their date. She had worried that Damon, despite his tender farewell, might not want to see a simple girl from the province again, especially with her challenging family background. Rosie had feared that Damon, being so smart, handsome, and successful, would be easily disappointed by her story. But after reading the postcard, where Damon confessed his love once again and invited her on another date, Rosie was over the moon. She was now sure that Damon was truly in love with her, and she realized she was head over heels in love with him too. Damon wrote that he would wait for her at the entrance at noon, and Rosie couldn't sit still for the rest of the time. 5 minutes before the appointed time, Rosie dashed out onto the street where a familiar car was waiting. Damon stepped out to meet her, taking her hand. "Let's go quickly. I have a surprise for you. I think you'll like it." In half an hour, they arrived at a sturdy wooden building in front of a fenced field. "Well, here we are," Damon smiled. "Let me show you something." Hand in hand, they approached one of the buildings. Rosie gasped with delight. "It's a stable. The dream of my life." "How did you know?" Damon looked at Rosie with a mysterious smile. "In my experience, all princesses love to ride horses. I'm sure you'll love it too." Rosie quickly learned to handle the perfectly white stallion assigned to her. In just under an hour, she was happily galloping around the circle, confidently holding onto the saddle. When the ride ended, Rosie kissed Damon on the cheek, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you so much. I've only seen horses on TV before. This is unforgettable. I'll remember this day for the rest of my life." "Why remember it for just a day?" Damon whispered gently, pulling her close. "We can come here every weekend if you like." He kissed her, and Rosie felt overwhelmed by her emotions. They spent the rest of the day and night together in a beautiful hotel on the lake. A romantic candlelit dinner was set in a gazebo above the water, followed by a bed strewn with rose petals and heartfelt love confessions. From that day on, Rosie and Damon began dating. He often met her after her flights, showered her with expensive gifts, and took her to the city's most fashionable restaurants. Despite the whirlwind romance, Rosie never wondered why Damon, despite having a large apartment, never invited her there. One day, Mrs. Gibson, who had never interfered in Rosie's life before, asked, "I don't understand. If you're so in love, why hasn't he proposed yet? He's not married, is he?" Rosie responded with indignation, "What are you talking about? He spends so much time with me and spends a lot of money. He just has a lot of work right now. As soon as he deals with it, he'll take me with him. Maybe we'll even get married." Mrs. Gibson shook her head, unconvinced. "If he truly loves you, he wouldn't want to be apart from you, even for a moment." At that moment, Rosie was too happy to argue. One day, she started feeling nauseous and had a strong reaction to certain smells. Remembering how her late mother had experienced the same symptoms, she went to the doctor and found out she was pregnant. Rosie was ecstatic, thinking of the happiness of having a child with her beloved. She rushed to share the news with Damon, imagining a joyful, movie-like reaction. However, his response was cold and unexpected. "I hope you're not thinking of having the baby just to continue the cycle of poverty like your mother. I don't need this child at all." The words hit Rosie like a thunderbolt. She was sitting on the hotel bed where they usually met, and the shock almost made her faint. She couldn't believe that the man she loved was speaking to her with such detachment and cruelty. Damon continued, "Did you think I'd tie my life to someone like you? You're just my entertainment, a temporary fling. I'll marry someone worthy, a fiancé from a well-known, noble family with a good dowry, including 2 sewing factories. We've been together for a year, and in 3 weeks, we'll be married. What do you have besides a pretty face? Your dowry consists of a bunch of siblings. I'm sorry, but I don't need that kind of wealth." He pulled out a thick stack of bills from his wallet and threw them onto the coffee table. "I think this should cover the problem. Please, don't make a scene or bother me anymore. From now on, you're on your own and I'm on my own." As soon as the door closed behind him, tears streamed down Rosie's face like a waterfall. She cried silently, feeling as though her heart had stopped beating. Desperate, she ran to the window, flung it open, and inhaled the air greedily, as if afraid of suffocating. She looked down from the 6th floor and climbed onto the windowsill, but as she tried to steady herself, her foot slipped. She fell to the floor, shaken but unharmed. At that moment, Rosie felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, God," she thought. "You saved me from a terrible mistake. I have my family. I'm going to live no matter what." To her surprise and relief, Mrs. Gibson, upon learning of the incident, didn't lecture or moralize. Instead, she gently patted Rosie's head and said, "Life is testing you again, but don't worry. We'll get through it together." They agreed never to speak of Damon again, and he stopped appearing on Rosie's flights. Rosie's morning sickness ended quickly, and she threw herself into her work with renewed energy. No one on the crew suspected her condition. She didn't know how she would manage, but she decided to leave everything to fate. In the sky, she found solace, focusing on her passengers and finding strength in her work. One day during a flight, a cry for help came from the cabin. An elderly woman was holding the head of a 7-year-old boy who was suffocating. It turned out he had asthma, and his grandmother had forgotten to bring his inhaler. Rosie, recalling everything she knew about assisting passengers in distress, immediately sprang into action. "Help, please," the elderly woman cried. "Sam, my only grandson. Rosie asked Miranda to tend to the elderly woman and quickly began to administer first aid. Her training and quick thinking gave her the strength to tackle the emergency. Rosie helped the boy with the necessary breathing exercises, calmed him down, and made sure he was seated comfortably to get more air into his lungs. She offered him a few sips of a hot drink, and gradually, his breathing returned to normal. The grandmother, tears in her eyes, thanked Rosie profusely, explaining that they had narrowly avoided a tragic fate. It turned out that the boy's father, who had been paralyzed for over a year, was a result of a horrific accident involving a minibus collision. After the incident, a grateful passenger approached Rosie, asking her to visit their home. "Please don't refuse," she pleaded. "I spoke with your colleague and learned that you're only flying back tomorrow, and you don't have any relatives in the city. Please stay with us." Unexpectedly, Rosie agreed. She felt compassion for Mrs. Clark and decided to visit briefly. In the taxi, Sam sat next to Rosie, cheerfully recounting stories about his family. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, he had been in critical condition. Sam was a bright and engaging child. He recited poems and shared his knowledge enthusiastically. Mrs. Clark, noticing Sam's behavior, gently admonished him. "Sam, enough with the nonsense. Let's give our guest a break," she said, though she was not upset. "He usually doesn't act this way with strangers, but he must like you." Upon arriving at their apartment, Sam eagerly took Rosie's hand and led her toward the building. "Let's go quickly. I'll introduce you to my dad. He's very nice, even though he can't walk yet. Grandma and I go to church often to ask God to help him stand up." They reached the third floor of a new high-rise building, and Rosie was struck by the elegance of the apartment complex. The lobby had a concierge, and the elevators were pristine, with mirrors and artistic paintings adorning the stairwells and landings. Flowers decorated every corner. Mrs. Clark unlocked the door and called out, "Eric, we're home and we've brought a guest. We have a wonderful guest arriving. Rosie, don't be shy." At that moment, a man in a wheelchair emerged from the room, smiling broadly. "Well, finally. I've been waiting for you," he said, hugging his son, who ran to him. "So, tell me, how was your flight? And introduce me to our guests. Judging by her beautiful uniform, you must have found her in the sky." As they all entered the enormous living room, Mrs. Clark quickly recounted what had happened in the sky. With gratitude in her eyes, she added, "If it weren't for Rosie, I don't know how it would have ended." When everyone had calmed down a bit, Mrs. Clark headed to the kitchen, and Eric suggested a tour of the apartment. "Let me show you everything." "I was thrilled when I bought this place," he said. Rosie agreed, and the apartment truly amazed her. The dimensions were impressive: a large hall instead of a corridor, a living room that was as large as Mrs. Gibson's entire apartment, and a kitchen combined with a dining room. The bedrooms numbered 4. One, judging by Sam's toys and wallpaper, belonged to a child. The second was very delicate with a large bed and was a woman's room. Based on the suitcase from the plane, it belonged to Mrs. Clark. The third, according to Eric, was for guests and had minimal furniture and no personal belongings. Finally, the man opened the last door and said, "This used to be my wife's and my bedroom, but now it's my den." The room featured a large double bed, a dresser, and a built-in wardrobe with mirrored doors. Everything was in the same style and color, and it looked very beautiful. Next to the bed was a small table on wheels, filled with various medications. Then, they went to Eric's office. "This is where I work, and I work a lot," he said, somewhat embarrassed. "What do you do if it's not a secret?" Rosie asked, also embarrassed. "I'm impressed by your courage because many people in your situation give up." Eric turned to his guest and said, "I didn't come to this immediately. At first, I felt that life was over and there was panic. It seemed that everything had collapsed. My wife died, I was crippled, and my business partner turned out to be a scoundrel who betrayed me at the most difficult moment. As soon as I ended up in the intensive care unit after that terrible accident, he transferred all the money from our joint business to other accounts. Initially, when I started to recover slightly, I tried to find him, but unfortunately, It was all in vain. As Eric spoke, Rosie looked at a collage of photos on the wall. In many of the pictures, Eric was with an incredibly beautiful blonde, and both of their eyes, even in the photos, shone with happiness. There were several photos of Eric, still very young, standing in a soldier's uniform with his fellow soldiers. Since then, he hasn't changed much, except for now using a wheelchair. Suddenly, Rosie's attention was drawn to a group photo with about 10 people, men and women. She knew one person well, and there was no doubt about it. In the photo, slightly younger than now, Damon was standing. "Excuse me," Rosie said nervously. "Who are you in this photo?" the man asked, moving closer. Sadly, he replied, "These are former employees of my previous company." "Are you asking about the woman on the right of me, the darling of all the women in our office? That's the scoundrel who, taking advantage of my position, deprived me of everything I had. It's a good thing that this apartment remained. Now I'm trying to create something new, but starting alone, without money, and in such a position, is difficult." Turning to Eric, Rosie said with a hint of joy in her voice, "I think I can help you. Unfortunately, I know very well the person who betrayed you. He betrayed me too, or rather, my love. But that's not the point now. He hasn't disappeared. He usually flies on the same flight, although he has been trying to avoid me lately. He told me, by the way, that his business came from wealthy parents who died some time ago." Eric slapped his legs indignantly and almost shouted, "Well, see, parents, his grandmother raised him all his life, went out of her way to get him an education. And he, having studied, got a job with me and sent her to a nursing home. I found out about this completely accidentally, only after he betrayed me. Then he said his poor grandmother had died of a heart attack. A little later, I was very surprised when he offered to become my partners. He had money then and decided to invest it in the business. It turned out that after his grandmother's death, he sold her apartment. That was his whole capital. How did you meet, and where can he be found?" Rosie asked. She apologized and said she didn't want to discuss her relationship with this person, but would gladly help find him and expose him as a fraud. They spent some time developing a plan for their next steps against the swindler. Later, Mrs. Clark called them to dinner. During dinner, Rosie felt a deep connection with everyone, even though she had only known them for a short time. Sam was constantly talking to her specifically, and Mrs. Clark took great care of her, trying to offer the best pieces from the dishes. Rosie and Eric occasionally made eye contact, and Rosie felt especially warm each time. As they parted, they promised to meet again. Mrs. Clark, noticing the glances exchanged between her son and the stewardess, was already hoping for their next meeting. She had liked Rosie from the first moment and had persuaded her to visit. Sam, clinging to Rosie's hand, wouldn't let go until she promised to visit them on her next flight. Upon returning to her city, Rosie easily tracked down her ex-lover, who continued to fly in the same direction but deliberately bought a ticket for a flight with a different crew. With his money, nothing seemed impossible, but only he thought so. Rosie managed to track him down and, upon landing, called Eric. At Damon's destination, the police arrested him. It turns out that acquiring large amounts of money does not equate to acquiring wisdom. During this time, the swindler had changed his passport, bought a small furniture factory, and planned to marry a rich bride, probably hoping to swindle his future father-in-law with the remaining money stolen from Eric. He even booked a honeymoon trip that he never took. He no longer needed any vacation packages. During the trial, the investigator discovered that, in addition to blatantly stealing his companion's money, the villain was also responsible for the terrible accident that killed Eric's wife. Upon learning this, Eric, confined to a wheelchair, was ready to crawl over and strangle the scoundrel right in the courtroom. Only Rosie, who sat next to him, was able to calm him down by taking his hand. Damon was given a considerable sentence, and Eric received a decent amount of money, which was used for a spinal cord operation. A year had passed. "Darling, darling, don't worry," Eric said lovingly. Rosie, standing at the altar on her wedding day, felt an overwhelming sense of trust, love, and respect for the person beside her. For the first time in her life, She realized that he was the one sent to her by fate. It was Eric who would stand behind her like a stone wall, not only for her, but for everyone present at the wedding in the church. Rosie turned around and barely held back her tears. Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Gibson, holding the hands of Rosie's twin brothers, stood behind her, glowing with happiness. Sam proudly rocked the stroller with the baby girl. The noticeably grown-up Paul ran back and forth between his brothers and the newborn niece, trying to help them each time. Judy stood aside, as always, ready to help at any moment but not participating in anything. When the priest proclaimed the young couple husband and wife, everyone clapped and rushed to hug the newlyweds. Mrs. Clark cried and said to the bride, "Fate sent you to us for a reason. You are our savior." Eric, still limping a little, approached and hugged his wife. "Well, my dear," he said so lovingly that Rosie was on the verge of tears, "now we will all go to our big house, where everyone will have a place." Initially, Rosie didn't pay much attention to Eric's words. However, when they arrived at a beautiful 3-story house, she looked at her husband questioningly. "I just thought," Eric began mysteriously, "that even in our huge apartment, such a family would feel cramped. So I made this arrangement. Now we will all live together here in the fresh air. Mrs. Gibson, there will be a big room for you too. Additionally, your son and grandchildren can come to visit you here, and my mom will have more fun with you." Initially, the residents of the cottage were skeptical of the noisy family. However, over time, the close-knit large family won the love and trust of everyone, from young to old. They became the largest, but also the most loving and friendly family in the district.